Okay, please remember that this meeting is being recorded. All right. Perfect. All right, we are going to go ahead and start. We have a new song this week, so we're going to go ahead and play that. So this song is about the Sugar Act that we learned about last week. Y'all remember learning about the Sugar Act? Good deal. So that's what this is about.
I'm hurting, Britain. I'm breaking down. I was a merchant of great renown.
Let me see if I can put it on the thing. Hold on, sorry. See if I can. Okay.
The 13 colonists, baby, from the Caribbean. I don't want to be feeding you tax. I don't like the sound of your rack. Sounds get my business each day. Ooh, Britain, cause I really don't care for your laws. I just want to look out for my cause that I really just don't want to pay. Sugar, you please, won't you keep your tax away from me? I'm right here, and I need little room to keep on smuggling. Yeah, I made a good living, made it alright. Now your little sugar act makes things tight. Sugar, oh please, won't you keep your tax away from me? My brown molasses, I sold these. It was so cheap to get from the West Indies. Then you came along and you passed a law on April 5th of 1764. I don't want you searching cargo, I just don't know how far you go, and you're killing the rum industry. Ooh, Britain, cause I really don't care for you fools. I'm gonna keep bending your rules, or it means less profit for me. I'm sugar, you see, won't you keep your tax away from me? I'm right here, and angry at the bread out of Navy. Yeah, they know that I'm a smuggler, sneaking through the night. Now that custom guards are extra tight. I'm sugar, you keep the tax away from me. I want that Lord Grenville, Britain's Prime Minister, to lax his greedy act, to me it's sinister. 1 gallon used to be 6 pence a tax till he reduced the cost per gallon from 6 pence right down to 3. But I don't want to pay it, see, and he won't get a cent from me. To give me all that tax, I'm working duty free. That's for sugar. It was cheap, so keep the tax away from me. Right here, 'cause I need to support the perfect colonies. I saw them get molasses, make a tiny sum, add a little sweetness to their rum. Sugar, please, won't you keep the tax away from me? Sugar, please, from the friend of the West Indies. I'm right here, I need less of purpose to run me. I pay taxes or other colonies, but can I be exempt? Pretty please. Sugar, please, keep the tax away from me.
All right. I don't know. Yes.
I think they were saying that they were selling molasses and they would like put sugar in it, and then the king priced the sugar higher than it was before. So then they had to steal the sugar.
Okay, so we have to get through, y'all, under Wit and Wisdom. It says George versus George Part 2. Oh, okay, it took up the whole screen. Didn't know it was going to do that. So go ahead and I can zoom.
So do we go to?
You go to the one that says Part 2. Yes.
What's on part 2?
Okay. Make sure that you have opened the one that's under Wit and Wisdom, and it says Part 2. We are going to start with the slide that's slide 2. It says comprehension questions, George versus George. Where we left off on Thursday was they had just had the Boston Tea Party where they dumped all the tea into the Boston Harbor and then and remember King George got real mad and he closed the Boston Harbor so nothing could come in and out. We're going to start right here. Let's go ahead and read the question before we begin. Use our good testing strategies. What were the colonists thinking about their future since the British closed their ports? And I will give you a hint. You're going to get the answer for this very quickly. It's going to be within like the first few sentences of what I'm about to read. Also, I went through the assignments from last week and I was kind of disappointed because a lot of y'all had a lot of lowercase i's. Some of the answers weren't anywhere related to the questions, like at all. Like at all. So let's make sure that this week, I'm just going to officially say it. We're going to have to do complete sentences and flip the prompts. And I'm going to help you flip the prompts, but we have to make sure that we are getting our brains ready for 5th grade and for ACT Aspire. Got it? I'm not sure if your cameras are off or if it's just the internet. Might just be the internet. Girls, if your computers are not almost dead, I need you to be at your seat. All right, so what were the colonists thinking about their future since the British closed their ports? Let's be listening. The port closure quickly put huge numbers of Bostonians, those are people that live in Boston, out of work. Oh, my computer's made a weird sound. Can y'all turn your cameras on? Yeah, mine just made a weird noise. Okay, hold on. Virtual human, stand by. I'm coming right back. All right, I think that's the best we're going to get. All right, the port closure quickly put huge numbers of Bostonians, so people that lived in Boston, out of work. People were afraid that they would starve. Other colonies scrambled to help by sending food, clothing, and flocks of sheep. Americans smuggled in at least 5,000 chests of tea from Holland alone. They also smuggled in gunpowder. Bostonians began to think of war as the only option for an end. So let's pause right there. The question says, what were the colonists thinking about their future since the British closed their ports? So you guys need to flip that question. So your answer should start with, since the British, why are you not typing? Okay. Since the British closed their ports, comma. So do you see how we flipped that question and we made it into part of our answer? What were the colonists thinking about their future since the British closed their ports? Since the British closed their ports, comma, the capital I think the colonists were thinking. So even before you go read, you can have that typed already because you know that that's how you can flip the prompt. Are you, Laneja, I need you on this slide. Okay. So what did it say? It said that huge numbers of people were out of work. The people were afraid that they would starve. They were smuggling in a bunch of tea, and the other colonies were scrambling to send food. The people started to begin to think of war as the only option. So what were the colonists thinking? They thought that they were going to what? They thought that they were going to starve and that their only option would be to what? Go to war. So you need to make sure that the end of yours looks like mine, or that the beginning of yours looks like mine, and then add your answer. Since the British closed their ports, I think the colonists were thinking that they were going to starve and that they were going to have to go to war.
What's your screen? Which one are we on?
Oh.
Like,
Okay, sorry. I guess when I hit refresh, it stopped presenting. Oopsies. Miss Shelton is an imperfect person. All right. Boop. Can you see it now? All right.
The presentation is loading.
Great. We're on slide 2. So the question says, what were the colonists thinking about their future since the British closed their ports? And we flip the prompt so it says, since the British closed their ports, I think the colonists were thinking and we said that the colonists were worried that they were going to starve and that they were going to have to go to war. That war might be their only option. So I'm going to keep reading while y'all are typing. As the siege continued, people from all over the colonies became more and more alarmed. If Boston was in such a sea of trouble, who was to say that worse things couldn't happen in Philadelphia or Williamsburg or Charleston?
You want me to do both of them?
I'm going to read this really fast and then you can do mine. All right. If Boston was in such a sea of trouble, who is to say that worse things couldn't happen in Philadelphia or Williamsburg or Charleston? George Washington didn't approve of the Tea Party one bit, but he approved of the punishment even less. During September and October of 1774, delegates from all 13 colonies met together in one place for the first time ever. So all 13 governors met for the first time ever at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. George Washington was one of the delegates. The Congress sent an appeal for peace and harmony to King George and suggested that Parliament get rid of all the unconstitutional laws controlling America. Until then, the colonies would not import or buy any British goods and would not export any of their own goods to the mother country. So you should have your answer typed by now. Can you just read this passage for them? All right, guys. So there's insurance people coming around, and so they just sent a lovely human to me. So we are going to read this question real quick. We are now on slide 3, and this is what you guys are going to be listening for, okay? So would the war eventually have happened if no one had shot their gun that day at Lexington? Why or why not? So you need to say, if no one had shot their gun that day, day at Lexington, comma, and then you need to say, I think the war would have eventually happened because, or you need to say, I think the war would not have eventually happened because. But our lovely human is going to read you just all the way down here and then to there.
Okay.
I was going to read you the pages, okay? And you guys be super polite and discuss, because remember, this is being recorded. That always helps. Be wonderful humans.
British General Thomas Gage had been trying hard to keep the peace in Massachusetts, but he was ordered in the name of the king to use more force in April 1775. A spy in Boston warned Gage that colonial troublemakers were stashing big piles of ammunition in nearby Concord. This was bad news. A bloody war could break out. Gage decided that the British Army had better go seize John Hancock and Sam Adams, two rebel leaders who were hiding out in Lexington. Then they should burn the weapons in Concord before people started getting themselves killed. Gage quickly planned a secret raid. Where are you going? A British regiment shivered through.
Put it on the dish. Put it on the dish.
A British regiment shivered through a chilly night, rowing and then wading across the Charles River. On the morning of April 19th, the soldiers had marched as far as Lexington when they came across about 70 patriot militia gathered on the village green. The rebels were armed because rebel spies William Dawes and Paul Revere had spread the alarm that the British were on their way. Everybody's nerves were on edge. Still holding their weapons, the Patriots began to back away and look for cover. Then someone fired a shot, nobody knows who, but as soon as they heard it, the British soldiers started shooting. 8 Americans were killed and 10 more were wounded. Not everyone realized it at the time, but the Revolutionary War had just begun. John Hancock and Sam Adams had disappeared. The Redcoats marched onto the Concord to destroy the ammunition, but most of the ammunition had vanished to meanwhile get multitudes of men from farms and villages all over the countryside gathered to fight back. Each side told a different tale about Lexington and Concord. Rebel newspapers reported that bloodthirsty redcoats burned houses, drove naked women into the streets, and butchered old men and infants. The king was told that rebel savages broke the rules of war by ambushing his army. Then they scalped fallen British infantry and cut off their ears. George Washington was already famous for his fearless leadership when he had fought alongside the British 20 years early on June 15, 1775. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia and unanimously elected the 43rd Virginian to become commander-in-chief of their newly formed Continental Army. But how could a small, poorly trained army with almost no money defeat one of the world's most awesome military powers? Washington refused to accept any salary, asking only that Congress pay his expense. The very next morning, long before Washington took command of his troops, the Redcoats back in Massachusetts awoke to discover an amazing sight. In just one night, about 12,000 rebels had secretly built a massive fort atop Breed's Hill by Charleston. Both sides fought fiercely until the rebels finally ran out of powder and ammunition. The rebels ended up losing the hill, but the British lost 92 officers, more than half of their men, and more than twice as many soldiers as the rebels lost. All right, y'all can type your thing, and that's all she left for y'all.
Are you standing here? Are you standing here?
Am I staying in here?
Oh, what is you?
She went to go do her insurance stuff, and then she'll be right back. Once y'all finish typing your stuff, I guess y'all can hang up, and then I don't know what y'all need to do.
Well, they gotta stay in the room.
Oh, well, y'all have to stay until she comes back. So.
Yeah, I'll just stay on here because school doesn't end until 2:30
Right.
or 2. 2:30 to 2 is when we leave. What's up here?
We can leave. Yeah, just stay, but they gotta stay. Unless you want us to stay on here, we gotta finish the.
Well, just finish what y'all are supposed to finish. What she told y'all to finish.
We don't have to. AI. Yes, we do. We don't have to. AI what? We go to you on the next slide, actually. I'm trying to keep this air in.
Y'all better be paying attention. I'm always watching.
She's always watching.
Better make sure you're paying attention, my friends. If you'd like to, we can go ahead. You can go ahead and read the next page if you can. I should be back up there here shortly.
Somebody.
I know that was why I did it. That's exactly why I did it.
Okay. Who said that? King George made it official. The colonists were rebel outlaws, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men. Traitorously preparing war, enough was enough. He had to show them who was boss. The king enlisted more troops in Britain and hired German troops too. He sent ships to blockade the American coast so the colonists couldn't get any outside supplies. Then his soldiers sat back to wait for the colonial army to fall to pieces. The king's war, hardened, brutally disciplined, and well-trained fighting force included 5 kinds of fighters. British regular. All senior officers were noble men. Each step up in rank was bought for large sums of money. Privates usually enlisted for life. Most were recruited in taverns, debtors' prisons, and slums, or were convicted criminals. Though their pay was extremely low, every single one proudly wore an elegant, brightly colored uniform. Officers and privates alike looked down their noses at Americans as backward peasants who couldn't be taken seriously. To them, George Washington was a rebel rouser, not a general. British officers addressed him as Mr. Washington instead of General Washington in their letters. Heathens, about 30,000 tough, highly trained German troops were paid to fight for the British, who couldn't raise enough troops at home. Most Britons' money filled their pockets of German prince who had sold the men's service. The soldiers themselves were poorly paid. Loyalists, also called Tories, about about one of every 5 American soldiers fought alongside British troops or acted as their guides or spies. Most were honorable people who risked their lives for the crown. Most, not all, came from the privileged classes. Others were black slaves who hoped to gain their freedom by rejoining the army. Indians, a majority of Native Americans in the war, fought for Great Britain, mainly to take away their land. British Navy, considered the world's finest naval force, its 468 war vessels and transports moved almost unopposed up and down the east coast of North America to deliver fresh military supplies and food from England to British troops. In Europe, soldiers were taught that the fair and honorable way to fight was to march openly into battle in columns. Columns line up in rows, shoulder to shoulder, and advance toward the enemy without firing a shot until they were close enough to be sure of hitting their targets. Since their muskets were not very accurate, they fired together all at once. Troops were traditionally trained to fight on flat land during the daytime in good weather. Nothing had prepared them to fight their way through thick forests, raging rivers, mosquito-infested swamps, and long mountains ranges. George Washington took command of the colonial army, the Colonists' main fight force, on July 3rd, 1775, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He immediately took steps to build a professional army. It wouldn't be easy. Washington despaired over the inexperience of his volunteers, the constant desertions, and a paralyzing lack of food and military supplies. Sometimes redcoats could shoot rebel shoulders at will because the rebels didn't have enough gunpowder to shoot back. There were 3 types of force fighting against the British. George Washington's colonial army. Most men in the volunteer army were private citizens who had signed on for a year or less. The great majority bought their own weapons, food, and clothing. Some colonials bought uniforms for their regiments, but most soldiers never owned one. They wore hunting shirts instead. Compared to the opponents, the men had little training and even less pay. Though the soldiers were promised money and land for their service, the colonial Congress rarely paid on time, if at all. Sometimes there were as many soldiers who deserted each day as their men were who signed up to fight to fill their ranks. Rebel forces began accepting free blacks and later accepted slaves. By the war's end, some estimated that about 1/4 of the colonial army was black. The army also got tremendous boosts from foreign volunteers, including experienced, quick-witted leaders from France, Germany, and Poland. A handful of Washington's highest-ranking officers were brilliant leaders, but many were unfit for office and looted solid army blankets and disobeyed orders. The officers included a Boston bookseller, a breeches maker, a horse dealer, a hat maker, an innkeeper, a blacksmith, an English corporal who had deserted, a preacher, a butcher, a farmer, a farm hand, a tanner's hand, a swineherd, and a dancing teacher. Huh?
We could do this
I see.
very quickly. Nope. Thank you so much.
Did you look in the chat?
Shh. We got to get through it. Oh, yes, I miss you too. Okay. Next is the Continental Navy. So, did she read the questions beforehand? Okay, that's fine. We'll get to the question. The infant navy defended the coast. At its height, it only had 57 ships. The Navy couldn't hope to challenge the huge British warships, so it tried its best to damage British trade and capture or destroy enemy vessels. The Americans also had a trick up their sleeves. They were getting extra help from as many as 1,697 privately owned armed vessels. These privateers preyed upon enemy merchant ships. George Washington was part owner of at least one of them. What are we doing over there? You don't need a pencil for anything.
No, to write it down.
You don't need a pencil for anything. I'm trying to figure out why y'all are over there with so many things. I need y'all to just be on your computer on the Google Meet. There's nothing we need to write down. We're just typing. I need you to go back over there. All right. Let's see here. The third branch of the American Army, or the rebel forces, were the militias. Since long before the Revolutionary War, many local areas and every colony except Pennsylvania had raised separate armed forces called militias to defend their communities from attack. Most of these soldiers had even less training than the men in the Continental Army, and their record was mixed. But militias played a crucial role in every one of Washington's victories, and they were very effective in some other important battles as well, because this was partially because their style of fighting was new to their enemies, but it was mostly because they could raise enormous numbers of men on short notice and outnumber their opponents. As difficult as things were for the rebel forces, they did have some strong advantages. Though George Washington drilled his army in British-style warfare, rebel soldiers had learned from fighting the Indians to travel light, hide in the woods and mountains, and use ambushes and lightning raids against unsuspecting enemy. They could move quickly, and their earth-toned, homespun, and buckskin camouflage clothing let them melt into the countryside unseen. The British considered these tactics to be dishonorable. Okay, so I know that everything that she read while I was gone, plus everything she just read just now, is kind of confusing. So I'm going to break it down for you a little bit easier. I don't know what this is. Sorry, Mr. Baker. So I'm going to break it down a little bit easier. Did y'all answer the question on the last slide?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So I'm going to break it down a little bit easier for you guys. Hope that everybody's listening. Move her. All right, so we've got the. Can I see that? We've got the British forces and the American forces. All right, yeah, you can see those. So, 1, 2. You do not have to write these down. This is not the answer to the question. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. But before I do, let's go over these questions. It says compare and contrast British soldiers and American soldiers. So if they're wanting you to compare and contrast, they're wanting to know one way that they are the same and one way that they are different. Very good. So you need to make sure that when you are answering question 1, we are going to make double sure that we have an example of one way that the two are the same and one way that the two are different. Number 2 says, how are the fighting styles of the British different than the Americans? We're kind of comparing still, so we're going to make sure that we give a clear and detailed answer for that. The number 3 is a question that you would probably see on the ACT Aspire, and let me tell you why. It says, were the advantages and disadvantages of each army? So that means you need to tell an advantage of the British Army and a disadvantage of the British Army, an advantage of the American Army, and a disadvantage of the American Army. So it is almost a 4-part question in one, and that is one of those higher level questions that you will see on the ACT Aspire because it is asking for advantages and sharing my screen so that it can be a little bit bigger. Go ahead and pin my classroom screen of me, like right here. Boop, boop, this one. All right, so the 5 branches of the British Army were the British Regulars. You do not have to write this down. We are just comparing and contrasting. So another word for these British Regulars were the Redcoats. Not my best handwriting. The Hessians, the Loyalists, the Indians. Now, it made sense that the Indians wanted to fight on the side of the British because the colonists were coming in and taking over their land, right? So they knew that if they fought with the British and the British won, then they would be able to get their land back. So the British forces had 5 parts. The rebel forces had 3. They had, we're going to put GW. Who do you think GW stands for? George Washington's Continental Army. We had the Continental Navy and the militias. So let's go ahead and figure out one way that these are the same and one way that these are different. I'm trying to get that study. Okay, so what is one obvious way that they are different? How many branches of the British forces are there? 5. Virtual humans. How many branches of the British forces are there?
5.
Good, 5. And how many branches of the American forces or the rebel forces were there?
3.
3. So we know that one way that they are different is that the British forces had 5 branches. So you would say this is kind of smaller, one way the British forces and the American forces were different is that the British had more branches and more men. One way the 2 forces are the same so what branch do they have in common? They each have a branch of the
Navy.
Is that they both had a branch of the Navy. Let me share my screen again.
You're not presenting.
Yep. All of this, remember, will be available to you right after class on my channel. One way that the British forces and the American forces were different is that the British had more branches and more men. One way that the 2 forces are the same is that they both had a branch of the Navy. Yes. Yes. So now we are comparing the fighting styles. So I'm not sure, hopefully she read the page on the British forces, right? Okay. So it says in Europe, so that's the British, The soldiers were taught that the fair and honorable way to fight was that they would line up in columns, kind of like we do here in, lines at school. So they would line up in lines, straight lines, shoulder to shoulder. It would kind of look like an array. And, and they would all march slowly together, and then they would all fire at once. The Americans were trained with British tactics, which means they were trained to fight like that, but they also were trained, and they kind of weren't as organized because they were also trained to ambush and camouflage. So how are the fighting styles of the British different than the Americans? So how would you flip that to start that answer? You have to flip the question to become the beginning of your answer. So how would you start that? The question says, how are
The fighting styles of British are different than Americans because.
Thank you. The fighting styles of the British were different than the Americans because. You have to use the question as part of your answer every time. If someone says, what's your favorite color? You don't just say red. You say, my favorite color is red. So if it says, how are the fighting styles of the British different than the Americans? You need to say, the fighting styles of the British were different than the Americans because. We just said the British believed the only fair way to fight was to be in organized rows and columns and all shoot together. The Americans were not as organized. If you are not typing this, then I'm not sure what you're doing. Then you need to reload it. So, the third question says, what were the advantages and disadvantages of each army? So, what would be one advantage of being in the British Army, knowing what we know about them?
You get discounts on like your bills or you wouldn't have to pay extra taxes.
Okay, so one advantage of being in the British Army is that you wouldn't have to pay extra taxes. And they also had more men, right?
Yes.
The army also had more soldiers. What's one disadvantage? Who do you think, here I'm going to give you a hint. Who do you think would be more familiar with the land? The rebel forces or the colonists?
George Washington was an army man.
So one disadvantage of being in the British Army was that, and it said that their muskets were not very accurate. Were not very accurate, and they were less familiar with the land. Now, what's one advantage? Because remember, I said you have to tell one advantage and one disadvantage of both. One advantage of being in the rebel forces. What's one advantage of being in the rebel forces? What's one advantage of being in the American forces?
You know the land.
They had learned, it says, as difficult as things were for the rebel forces, they did have some strong advantages. Though George Washington drilled his army in British-style warfare, rebel soldiers had also learned from fighting the Indians to travel light and hide in the woods. They learned how to ambush. So one advantage of being in the rebel sources is that they were not only trained in British-style fighting, but they also had learned how to camouflage and ambush.
It's also a small amount of them, so they're more likely to stay safe because they're by themselves.
That's true. So one disadvantage. What's one forgot the F. What's one disadvantage?
They have more forces. They have food and resources.
So the British did. So one disadvantage of being in the American Army is that they didn't have as many resources or as many soldiers. Okay, that's as small as I can make it, guys. So make sure that you have something that somewhat matches mine. My what? My what? Yeah, in my car. Yeah, I have it in my car. I can, yeah, it's in my car. If not, tell her to hang on to it and we can do it tomorrow morning. How does she get home? I can run out there. Okay, I can run out there and I'll put it back on her. Tell her it might burn a little bit, but it's okay. Okay, bye. Remember, guys, if you are struggling to get all of this done, it will be available on YouTube. Okay. All right, guys. So make sure that yours matches mine. My virtual humans that have your computers, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing because this will be available on YouTube probably before 3 o'clock. Okay. So you guys will be able to finish it then.